Now, let's talk about the Second Bank of the United States, and this gets even more interesting. In 1860, a 20-year charter was given to the Second Bank of the United States, seemingly as an attempt to recover from the War of 1812. Remember, they need money, Congress. The bank was essentially the same as the first in function, yet it was authorized to create money for the federal government and to regulate state banks. Now, the intent of the central bank was for monetary stability, as is often claimed. Given this, you certainly could not defend the problems that occurred after this new bank was in place. The Panic of 1819, for example, was a massive bust which injured a great amount of the population. Debates rage as to its cost, but one thing we do know is that it happened on the watch of this new, supposedly stabilizing institution, which was supposed to derail such things. Keeping this in mind, if you track Andrew Jackson's writing, who was elected in 1828, he was extremely outspoken against the central bank for all of these reasons and many more if you read his writings. At this time, the bank was under the control of Nicholas Biddle. By the time he was elected into office, Jackson was preparing to get rid of the bank, and Biddle knew this. They became powerful foes, and there's tremendous arguments between them you can find in the historical record. Nevertheless, Biddle did something very interesting. When Jackson was up for re-election in 1832, Biddle requested Congress to grant an early renewal of the bank's charter, thinking that Jackson would just go along with it, thinking that he would have to secure his election, thinking it would be against the popular interest. And it didn't work. Jackson instead put his entire political career on the line and vetoed the measure, stating publicly, "Gentlemen, I have had men watching you for a long time, and I am convinced that you have used the funds of the bank to speculate in the breadstuffs of the country. When you won, you divided the profits amongst you. When you lost, you charged it to the bank. You tell me that if I take the deposits from the bank and annul its charter, I shall ruin 10,000 families? That may be true, gentlemen, but that is your sin. Should I let it go on, you will ruin 50,000 families, and that would be my sin. You are a den of vipers and thieves." This is a pretty heavy thing for a president to say. Would you not agree? I think it's incredible how these notions are just dismissed and often demonized by certain figures that just arbitrarily think that banking systems have some type of good for the country as a whole. By the way, that was from the original minutes of the Philadelphia Committee of Citizens, February 1834. Excuse me. So anyway, Jackson succeeded to shut down the central bank during his presidency, and he also paid off the entire national debt, which was the first time in American history that's ever been done. Which was the last time in American history that's ever been done. Central banks are machines of debt, and all you have to do is look at the money supply to see that evidence. So to summarize this, the interest of Congress was to have a central bank to bypass restrictions on fiat currency production as noted by the U.S. Constitution. They wanted to spend more money, so they decided to sanction a bank. They could simply borrow it. This is why after each bank's creation, inflation increased dramatically. The people that had the banks were always incredibly corrupt and were of the commercial class, often foreign ownership. In fact, there's many ties to the Rothschilds of the first bank of the United States. Regardless of that speculation, we could debate stability. The issue of stability, the number of booms and busts that have occurred since these banks have been in operation, including the Federal Reserve, should be enough to bring into question the reality or the illusion that there's some sort of stability aspect to these banks. It's actually the complete opposite. Things have gotten worse. And just look around you today, right now, and ask yourself where the stability is. And by the way, just to throw in there, the ownership of the Federal Reserve Bank, who did the Congress bail out first? They bailed out the Federal Reserve banking cartel. Go back and look it up. It makes perfect sense. Who's really in charge? You have to ask yourself. All right, the fifth point. The Panic of 1907. Zeitgeist talks about J.P. Morgan as the cause of the panic, initiating rumors about a default bank, the Knickerbocker Bank, creating bank runs and triggering all sorts of business and banking collapses. The bunkers, of course, say that there's no evidence to suspect any kind of Morgan collusion, and one debunker even said that the Frederick Allen quote that was denoted in the film that suggests this or brings it up doesn't even exist. Well, it's of course not true. It does exist. Now, while the issue is indeed somewhat speculative, as with anything of this nature, we're dealing with probabilities, and the idea that Morgan was behind the panics comes from a few sources. It also comes from all sorts of earlier issues with Morgan and his particular political ways that stretch all around this period. Morgan has, if you learn about J.P. Morgan, there's so much information about his collusion with government and manipulation. It's unbelievable, and it shouldn't even be surprising if this was the case. But be that as it may, the bank that began the panic was the Knickerbocker. The issue of rumors, it depends on who you want to believe. The Life magazine article called Morgan the Great, Life, April 25th, 1949, page 26. Frederick Allen, who wrote it, doesn't agree that Morgan was involved, but he does point out the fact that that idea has been created. So it's not just, people say Zeitgeist made this up. No, these are things that are out there that need to be pointed out. But given that, you go take it what you will with that, as it's just one person's word against another. Let's go to Congressman Charles Lindbergh in his book, Banking and Currency and the Money Trust. Here's what he writes about the 1907 panic. Quote, "None of us will have the opportunity to do what he did at this time, because when we really understand, we will not permit anyone to fleece us as J.P. Morgan & Co. and other bankers have fleeced us. The King bankers put in motion in 1907 a great scheme. They had gambled and speculated on Wall Street until so many watered stocks and bonds had been manufactured on speculation that numberless spectators, big and small, sprang up all over the country." Sound familiar? The largest crop ever grown upon that time was harvested in 1907. The King bankers knew the condition and informed the favored of their friends what was to come. There was to be a panic in the fall of 1907 that would be advertised as the result of our bad banking and currency laws. This 1907 panic was to be the full means by which the people were to be forced to enact new laws guaranteeing the full face value of the watered stocks and bonds. That guarantee would make the people pay the interest and dividends on them forever. Thus, in 1907, we were given a panic as the initial move for the proposed the Aldrich Plan. And as many of you know, the Aldrich Plan is what eventually turned into the Federal Reserve Act, and we're going to be getting to more of that as we continue. Now, he talks about the money trust in a lot of his writings. I hope everyone understands that the money trust was a sort of derogatory term that him and others by the way, the book that's from, the quote I just mentioned by Charles Lindbergh, was called Banking and Currency and the Money Trust. I think I mentioned that before. And this money trust concept is basically the banking establishment, including the Morgans and the Rockefellers and all of those that had this cartel under the table before they were officially made a cartel when the Federal Reserve came out. So, I think that this testimony paints an interesting picture. Granted, you can argue the subjectivity, but there are others who also feel the same way about these crashes that I don't have time to talk about. And as far as the Morgan rumor, that's indeed speculative. I don't know what to say. I put this information in there to challenge people's perception of what history has shown, because people should be taking all of this into account and making their own decisions. Now, the next point has to do with the panic of 1907 leading to the congressional investigation headed by Senator Nelson Aldrich. And he recommends, of course, that a central bank should be implemented so that a panic or any type of panic could never happen again. That was the gesture of the bill, was to derail any form of instability. Debunkers simply say that he was doing his job and he was in the best interest of the country and it was all for stability and there was no reason to suspect anything. Okay. Well, considering what Charles Lindbergh had to say, quote, that the 1907 panic was to be the means upon which the people would be forced to enact laws guaranteeing the full face value of the water stocks. That guarantee would make the people pay the interest and dividends on them forever. Thus, 1907, we were given a panic as the initial move for the proposed the Aldrich Plan. I think that's worth keeping in mind. There's reason to consider at a minimum that the 1907 panic was used for political purposes. That's for sure. And senators and congressmen have always, they've historically pointed out that possibility, as Lindbergh has said.